Here is Sidney Mosley, famous lecturer, author, and journalist, with his Headlines of Tomorrow. Brought to you by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures, whose daring dramatization of Oscar Wilde's famous novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, will open Thursday, March 1st at the Capitol Theater. This is the story that 3 generations have read in secret. A story that has enthralled its readers and will thrill and fascinate film audiences. Watch for The Picture of Dorian Gray, plus a gala in-person show featuring the king of Latin American swing, Xavier Cugat, and his orchestra, vivacious Lena Horne, and as a special added attraction, the lad you loved as Private Hargrove, Robert Walker. All in person and coming to the Capitol Theater Thursday, March 1st. And now, here is Sidney Mosley.
Thank you, Alan Edwards. Good evening. Well, let's look at tomorrow's headlines and see what they mean. Although we've had no official word so far on the results of the grand carrier plane smashes at Tokyo, eyewitnesses tell of the destructions accomplished by the huge task force armada. Super fortresses who scouted the Tokyo-Yokohama district tell of clouds of smoke billowing thousands of feet into the air after more than 1,500 Navy planes had dumped their bombs and rockets. And these pilots tell of scores of Jap planes blown up on the ground, too surprised by the attack to give battle. Well, I'll comment on this grand news in a minute. Meanwhile, Moscow announces officially that Breslau has been completely surrounded. Berlin says the Russians have seized the central Oder River stronghold of Kherson. On the Western Front, the Canadian First Army is meeting the fiercest enemy resistance since its offensive into the Ruhr began. Here's a note from Athens. The government passed a law today restoring freedom of the press to Greece. And here's a rumor for what it's worth. Quoting information from the Swiss frontier, Paris Radio tonight said that Dr. Schacht, former president of the Reichsbank, had arrived in Switzerland, quote, to try to contact neutral and allied personalities with a view to negotiating a German surrender, end quote. Needless to add, this report is so far unconfirmed, but one day it's going to prove to be true. And here at home, the House has approved the George Bill, thus clearing the way for Senate confirmation of Henry Wallace as Secretary of Commerce. Well, following the optimistic reports on developments in the war against Japan, which we discussed last night, comes the great news today of the devastating attack on the Tokyo area for at least 9 hours by more than 1,300 American planes. And these came from a huge naval armada which moved into less than 300 miles from the Jap coast. Now, Tokyo is pretending not to be worried, or not too much worried about this challenge to Nippon's power. But actually, they must be very worried indeed, because the indications are that this attack may precede a new and vital move by the American forces in the Pacific. This is obviously part of a big, bold plan which will slowly but surely unfold. In Washington, it's regarded as a public challenge to the Japanese Navy to come out and fight. And American naval men are making no bones about it. They're telling the Japanese Navy to come out and fight. We know where the Jap fleet is, and we know what its strength is. And if there's anything at all in the legend of Japanese face, well, there won't be much left of it if they refuse this challenge. The situation offers more possibilities than one can discuss in the interests of security. It would almost look as if we were finally softening up the Japanese even before Russia comes into the fight. It's interesting to read some of the comments from Tokyo on this raid. Domai, the Japanese official news agency, says that old and young are determined to fight to the death when our mainland becomes a battlefield. Well, that's a clear admission that they are thinking in terms of invasion. Full expectations of an American landing of Iwo Jima. It was also expressed by the Japanese radio with a comment that the constant aerial bombardment of the island is in line with Yank routine before landing operations. Maybe. But the magnitude of the U.S. fleet and task force is indicated in a dispatch today which says that they included the largest and newest American carriers, battleships, light carriers, cruisers, and destroyers. This task force is obviously the greatest in history, exceeding anything of its kind even dreamed of a few years ago. The Tokyo press produced joy in Chongqing, the Chinese war capital, which, as we know, has been hammered and hammered by Japanese planes. The newspapers of the city hail the raid as an almost unimaginable epic of American might and daring. And we haven't had the whole story yet. And Tokyo newspapers seem to have fared badly under the raid. According to a message from a Japanese source, the publications of newspapers in Tokyo were interfered with because the usual review of the Tokyo press could not be transmitted today. Well, the setting up of the new League of Nations at San Francisco seems to be overclouding interest in the Dumbarton Oaks discussion. Now, this shouldn't be. This plan, this peace plan, is highly important, and it's just as well to keep an eye on what is going on in the Congress debates. Many people seem to be under the impression that Dumbarton Oaks and the historic meeting at San Francisco have nothing in common. I've even heard people refer to the San Francisco meeting as if it were a peace conference, a kind of continuation of the Big Three meeting at the Crimea. Of course, it's nothing of the sort. At San Francisco, we hope to create a world organization, an organization on which the future peace, security, and happiness of the world will depend. But Dumbarton Oaks is the basis of this organization. People don't seem to realize it. The plans are the result of prolonged study and conferences between the representatives of the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. The plan, we know, has had a fairly wide acceptance, but it's been necessary to trim the proposals on the economic side in order to compromise with opposition from certain banking interests. Now, much of it is technical, and one knows, of course, that the average man can't understand the technical problems involved. But I would suggest that you keep your eye on development on the Dumbarton Oaks controversy, which you will be reading about very soon. I'll be back in a moment with more comments and news after a message from our sponsor.
Watch for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's brilliant screen drama, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Based on the intriguing novel by Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray is one of the most amazing stories ever told. It is destined to become one of the most talked about pictures ever made. With suave George Sanders, handsome newcomer Herb Hatfield, and beautiful Donna Reed in the leading roles, The Picture of Dorian Gray is a brilliant screen drama that promises a great new experience for filmgoers. Watch for The Picture of Dorian Gray, plus a town-topping in-person show featuring the king of Latin American rhythms, genial Xavier Cugat and his orchestra, the sizzling siren of swing, lovely Lena Horne, and as a special added attraction, the young star who scored such a solid hit as Private Hargrove, Robert Walker, all in person and opening on Thursday, March 1st at the Capitol Theater, Broadway and 51st Street. Now, back to Sidney Mosley.
Well, it looks as if the solution of the difficult problem of Poland may be shortly announced. Red Star today in Moscow recognizes the possibility that Mikolajczyk, former Prime Minister of the Polish government in London, and some of his supporters will join the new broadened Polish government, which will be set up in accordance with the agreement arrived at by the Big Three at Yalta. These and others, say the Russians today, are no doubt ready to assume the responsibility for the future destiny of Poland. And so they will take part in the coming reorganization of the Polish government. Now, meanwhile, the disappointed Polish government in exile in London was given what seems to me to be a farewell party by members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. The Polish government thanked the British government for the hospitality extended to the Poles. And that, it seems to me, is that, simply that. Well, the anticipated storm over the strange inactivity of UNRWA is blowing up tonight. Listeners will recall that I suggested that Governor Lehman should insist on being given a free hand or resign, otherwise they would be bound to blame him if anything went wrong. And now it seems that that is in the fire. UNRWA is being sharply criticized from all sides, and it looks as if there will be a complete inquiry into what is happening to the huge amount of money voted for this urgent relief in liberated countries. The trouble seems to be between military authorities and officials of UNRWA. Nobody can say without an official inquiry. You can't say for certain who is to blame. There's a lot of talk, which I won't pass on, but the fact seems to be is this. Mountains of supplies ready to feed the starving people are still being held in warehouses instead of being at the places for which they were intended. And that is simply wrong and can't go on. Dr. Everett, the Minister of External Affairs in Australia, says that a crisis is emerging. I should say it is. The crisis has been there for some time. Governor Lehman's job has been a very difficult one, and the sympathy is with him. At the same time, it's claimed that there are too many organizations overlapping, doing the same sort of work, and the Army is insistent on its part that priority of transport, etc., must be theirs, which, of course, is also understandable. And yet, meanwhile, the people starve, although we have done everything we could to avoid this tragedy. And so something must be done, and at once. And here's a curious note with the British troops in Germany, which has just come in. The Nazis are resorting to sugary appeals in an attempt to escape the destruction of their own property, such as they visited upon the rest of Europe. Allied troops advancing into the Reich on this northern front are greeted by English language signs, and we've got 2 or 3 examples which I'd like to read to you. One is, please treat this home as you would your own. Another is, we've done you no harm, do not harm our little home. But in some cases, the inhabitants have fled in such haste that they left behind plaster busts and photographs of Hitler on the mantelpiece, and that rather spoiled the effect. It's doubtful whether the GIs did treat these homes as they would their own. And out of the mass of Nazi comments on the war situation is one from Dr. Max Kroll, his military commentator of the DNB agency, who claims that the Allied raids on the towns in the path of the Red Army has had no strategic value. Well, Moscow thinks differently. It is paying great tribute to our air forces for the work it's been doing. Thank you and good night.
You have been listening to Sidney Mosley with his Headlines of Tomorrow, brought to you by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures, who will soon present The Picture of Dorian Gray. This Oscar Wilde story that 3 generations have read in secret is now startling screen fare, a new and dramatic film experience. Watch for The Picture of Dorian Gray, with a gala in-person show featuring the king of Latin American rhythms, Xavier Cugat and his orchestra, sultry songs by lovely Lena Horne, and as a special added attraction, you'll see in person the lad you loved as Private Hargrove, Robert Walker. Yes, a grand in-person show and a great picture opening Thursday, March 1st at the Capitol Theater. Listen again tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock when Sidney Mosley will again bring you his Headlines of Tomorrow.
15 minutes of news with Van Deventer will be heard at 6:30.
And now may I invite my listeners to stay tuned to the Minute of Prayer, which follows.